So through speciation, we have all the species that currently exist today, which give or take is about 1.5 million known species. And realistically, that's may only be halfway there, and that there are millions of unknown species. And what we do when we discover these species is we classify them. So we're talking about taxonomy, which is kind of the means by which we classify them. So if we classify them properly, a couple of things we can indicate. One is evolutionary relationships. So two species that are closely related will be classified similarly. And then that whether you know physically what the species look like or not, based on the classification, you can observe or predetermine certain shared characteristics. And that process is taxonomy. It's a process of organizing species, but also providing for them a universal name. Excuse me. So, use my good old Yankees as an example. This is Masahiro Tanaka from Japan. If you asked him what species he was, this is what he would write down. And if you were to say it, again, don't speak Japanese, but it would sound like Ninjin, I guess. This is Carlos Beltran. Actually, doesn't play for the Yankees anymore, but from Puerto Rico. Grew up speaking Spanish. If you ask him what he was, he'd say humano. And this is Derek Jeter, retired, yes, but a legend nonetheless. Born and raised in the United States. Obviously, he speaks English, and he would, of course, say human. Now, you have, albeit you can see the similarity between English and Spanish, but in Japanese, it becomes very difficult to determine. So, in the scientific world, they're all Homo sapiens. That is the term for humans. That is the universal name for humans that you would say no matter what language you speak day to day. Excuse me. Sorry. So that process of naming is called binomial nomenclature. And the two parts of a name are the genus and the species. So for instance, our genus is Homo. Our species is Sapien. There it is. Humans. Ursus arctos. Any guesses? That is the grizzly bear. That is the binomial universal name for grizzly bear. What about Ursus maritimus? Well, it's Ursus. It is, believe it or not, a bear, but it's actually a polar bear. Different species, but a bear nonetheless. And we use ultimately 7 taxa, all right, to name a species. And it goes in this order: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Or, great way to remember it, King Philip came over for a good soup. Or King Philip came over for good spaghetti. Excuse me again. All right, so for humans, we are in the kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Primata, family Hominidae, genus Homo, species Sapiens. Now, what about grizzly bears? How similar are we? Well, they are also animals. They're also Chordata. They're also mammals. But beyond that, they do differ. They're carnivora, Ursidae, Ursus arctos. What about the polar bear? Well, animals, Chordata, Mammalia, but carnivore, just like the grizzly bear, also Ursidae, also Ursus, and also Arctos, or Maritimus, rather. What about our closest relatives, the chimps? Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, Primata, Hominidae, Homo? No, Pan troglodytes. That's their species name. And just for giggles and ha-has, the Neanderthal, all right, does not exist, but did at one time. Chordata, Mammalia, Primata, Hominidae, Homo neanderthalis. Believe it or not, if the Neanderthal lived today, they would be our closest relative, but they are extinct. So if two species share many similar taxa, for instance, like we and chimps do, or like the two different types of bears do, one, it's a good indication that they're close related, and of course we are, and of course bears are as well. And whether you know what these species look like or not, you know that they share many similar traits. So, for instance, humans and bears share some similar traits, but we share many more traits with the chimps than we do with the different types of bears, just by looking at their names. All right, now what if we bring in other species? What about this guy? Now, it is an animal, but beyond that, it doesn't. So, as different as we are maybe from bears, we're much more like a bear than we are this species, just by looking at the names alone, because this species is a type of spider. And what about if we look at this one? We're going to go backwards here. All right. Now, this one is not even an animal. So, as different as we may be from a spider, we're much more like a spider than we are your common Christmas tree. All right, so the naming indicates, again, relation and similar traits. All right, and the system itself is hierarchical in that it's arranged from kingdom to species. The way this works is if you do not belong to a group, you will not belong to, or if you and another individual do not belong to a group, you will not belong to a group that exists below that. So, for instance, the snake, albeit as chordata, is not mammal. It will not reappear anywhere down the way. All right, it's not going to. You can't be chordata, not mammal, but a carnivora. All carnivora are mammals, for instance. Okay, and the way I look at it is, you can't say I live in Massachusetts, but I don't live in the United States. Living in Massachusetts automatically means you live in the United States. Okay. So kingdoms contain very large numbers. So kingdoms include millions and millions and millions of individuals, whereas the species themselves are much more smaller, much more specific. And the classification is organized by really these things: common characteristics. So there's common characteristics amongst animals. There's common characteristics amongst the chordata and mammalia and so on and so forth that they need to meet to be part of those groups. Genetically speaking, we use genetics and genes and DNA to determine these evolutionary relationships. And ultimately, we determine evolutionary relationships. So, for instance, the grizzly and the black bear are more closely related to each other than they are to the panda bear. But they are both more closely related to the panda bear than they are to the fox, and so on and so forth. So we need to look at we need to recognize that there are 6 kingdoms. And then they divided further into a larger group called domains, and there are 3 domains. So the title will be here, and this will be in yellow will be the domain. And the first kingdom I want to briefly talk about are the eubacteria, and they're part of their own domain, the bacteria domain. They are all unicellular. All right, in other words, they exist as single-celled organisms. They have cell walls with a material called peptidoglycan. glycan. That's the notable characteristic that makes them bacteria. And then, albeit I don't have it listed up here, it's probably worth noting that they're prokaryotes, that they do not have nuclei, they do not have organelles. Similar to these, but in their own kingdom, and likewise in their own domain, are the archaeobacteria, which belong to their domain archaea. They are bacteria in some way, but they are unicellular in that right. But their cell walls do not contain peptidoglycan, they contain other materials. And what makes them especially unique is that they live in extreme environments. So you're talking about thermal vents in the deep, dark depths of the oceans. You're talking about saltwater flats, places where very few, if any, other organisms can live. Everything from this point on is part of the domain eukarya, or if you will, the eukaryotes. And then before I forget, the archaea are also prokaryotes. But everything from this point on is a eukaryote, or part of the domain eukarya. They have a nucleus, they have organelles, and all the other complexities that makes them eukaryotes. And the first one are the protists, which are pretty much entirely unicellular. I know I put here colonial, meaning that they live with other individuals, and they do. But for the most part, we consider them unicellular. They have cell walls with cellulose. It's a carbohydrate that we commonly refer to as starch. It's also found in plants. But they are the unicellular eukaryotes. The fungi are mostly multicellular, almost all multicellular. A few unicellular fungi exist, but for the most part, they're multicellular. Their notable characteristic is that they have cell walls with a material in it called chitin. So we're talking about things like fungus, or obviously fungus, mold, even mushrooms are a type of fungus. All right, and they are heterotrophs in that they feed off other organisms. So, albeit this is gross, toenail fungus is actually feeding off some of your cells and some of the matter that exists on and underneath your toenails. The fungi grow out of the soil, feeding off nutrients in the soil, much like all the other heterotrophs. Then there's the plantae, the plants. Again, also eukaryotes. They're all multicellular. They have cell walls with cellulose, just like the prokaryotes, or the protists do. But one of their notable characteristics beyond being all multicellular is that they are all autotrophs, and that they also use chloroplasts to be autotrophs. And very diverse. So we're talking about trees, talking about shrubs, talking about moss and lichen. We're talking about bushes and shrubs, flowers, you name it. And last but not least is the animalia, the animals. Again, also eukarya. So they are multicellular. So the point I'm trying to raise with these two pictures is that yes, they're fuzzy, warm, and adorable, and they're also gross and cold and disgusting. No cell walls. That is a characteristic of animals that they do not have cell walls. So humans, for instance, or other insects do not have cell walls. And they are heterotrophs. All animals need to eat something else. But those are notable characteristics of animals, that they do not have cell walls, multicellular heterotrophs. And then last thing I want to talk about is the possibility of a seventh kingdom, and perhaps even a fourth domain, that may be agreed upon in our lifetime, and that is the virus kingdom, or if you will, the Varia domain. Not currently recognized, and may never be, but it's worth noting that it's a possibility. One of the reasons why they're not currently recognized is because they do not display all the characteristics of life. They display most of them, but not all of them. In particular, they can't reproduce on their own, and they have to reproduce in a host, meaning they have to attach to a cell, like we see these viruses doing here, and inject their DNA or RNA into the cell, and use the cell to reproduce more of the virus. They can't do it on their own. So when they invade a host cell to reproduce, and they're not made of true cells either. They have nucleic acids, but they're not a lipid membrane. They're actually a protein-based coat. So will viruses ever be a recognized living thing? No. Are they lifelike? I think we all can agree to that. But will they? Well, I won't say no, but it would have to be much debate for them to be considered the newest kingdom. But it is tentative. It is possible. Not tentative. It is possible because they are lifelike.